Hello everyone, see you again on the I Love This Game channel. This time I will show you the top 4 fastest wins from the opening of the Queen Gambit. The game of the Grand Masters, so don't go anywhere, watch the video until it runs out only at I Love This Game. Okay guys, before we start everything, let's build our favorite channel by pressing the subscribe button. If it's already done, let's go straight to the first game. Namely the match between Flo and Meyer Istvan that took place in 1950. Here Flo holds white, and Meyer holds black. Flo start with a pawn to d4, Meyer a pawn to d5. Continue pawn to c4. Queen Gambit. Here Meyer rejects Gambit. And advance the pawn to e6. Added pawn protection in d5. And Flo knight to c3. Pawn to c5. Pit pawns. Flo picks pawns, takes pawns on d5. Meyer pawn takes d4 pawn. Continue to threaten the knight. Flo continues to take pawn e6, and sacrifices knight at c3. Meyer accepts sacrifice, pawn take knight at c3. And threatening queen, Flo continued with pawn takes pawn at f7. Check. Let's look again. If the king takes pawn e7, obviously queen will be lost to queen. So here Meyer avoids checking to e7. Further pawn takes knight and promotion to knight. Check. Rook takes knight. And bishop to g5. Check. And this is where Meyer gives up. Because if the game continues, black will still lose his queen. Okay guys, let's continue the second one, which is the match between Berliner Hans and Rod, which took place in 1956. Here Hans holds white, Rod holds black. Hans starts with pawn to d4, Rod pawn to d5. Continue pawn to c4. Queen Gambit. Rod rejects Gambit and takes knight to f6. Added d5 pawn protection. Hans takes pawn d5. Knight takes pawn d5. Continue pawn to e4. Attack knight, knight retreat to b6. Knight to c3, knight to c6. Attacks the d4 pawn twice. Hans knight to f3. Added d4 pawn protection. Rod bishop to g4. Knight pin, pawn advance to d5, attack knight, knight to e5. Attack knight f3 twice. And here it turns out that Hans chose knight takes pawn e5. Let bishop takes queen, and Rod unhesitatingly takes queen. Continued Hans, bishop to b5. Check. Since the king couldn't move, Rod chose to advance the pawn to c6. Blocking check, Hans, pawn takes pawn c6. Pawn preparation will advance to c7 and discover check. If you were in this position, what would you play? So let's just move on. Here Rod even brought his queen to b8. Attack the knight, and unknowingly two-step checkmate starts from here. You can pause the video to find it. Yes, you are all right, starting with advancing the pawn to c7, discover check. Here is the step forcing knight to go to d7, blocking check, Dan Hans, bishop takes knight d7. Checkmate. Okay guys, let's move on to the third game, namely the match between Sigurdsson Yuan against Thorvaldsson, which took place in 1934. Here Yuan holds white, and Thor holds black. Yuan starts the game with the d4 pawn. Thor replies with a pawn to d5, then a pawn to c4. Thor rejects Gambit and advances the pawn to e6. Yuan continued, knight to c3, increasing pawn pressure on d5, Thor, knight to f6. Knight b to d7, pawn to e3, pawn to c6. Yuan, bishop to d3, Thor bishop to e7, castle. Tour also castle. Pawn advances to e4, pawn takes pawn, and tour selects pawn takes pawn c4. Bishop takes pawn c4, rook to e8, knight to g5, pawn to h6. Banish knight, and yuan, knight takes pawn e7. Sacrifice knight, tour accepts, king takes knight. Further, bishop e6, check. Bishop sacrifice again, tour accepts another sacrifice, king takes bishop. Continued yuan, queen to b3, check. In the game, tour blocks check with knight to d5, but actually the king can avoid checking to d6. Why is this move not played by tour? Because bishop will step into f4, check. Now knight's forced move to e5, block check. Pawn takes knight, check. If king to d7, pawn to e6, of course there will be a checkmate. So king to c7, avoids the check. Continue pawns takes knight f6, discover check, and in this position black will still have a hard time winning the game. Okay guys, back to the game. So after queen to b3, check. And here tour doesn't evade skak to d6 but brings knight to d5. Blocking check. Yuan continued, nig takes nig d5. From here, I bring again a little analysis, because tour brings the king to f7, why? Because if pawn takes knight, then queen takes pawn d5. Check. King's forced move to f6. And queen to d5. Checkmate. Okay, back to the game. After knight takes knight d5, tour doesn't take knight d5 with pawn but brings king to f7. And after looking back, it turns out that this was also a mistake, and here tour chose to give up. Let's continue. Why did tour give up? Because knight is going to f4, discover check, now king has two escape squares, namely to f8 or to f6. If king goes to f8 then knight goes to g6, of course there will be a checkmate. And if king goes to f6 there will be a checkmate in 3 steps. You can pause the video to find it. Yes, you are all right. Starting from queen to e6. Check. King's forced move to g5. Continue knight to g6, discover check. The king's forced step again to h5. And the last pawn to g4. Checkmate. Alright, let's move on to the 4th game. Namely the match between Nagel Herbert and Margulis, which happened in 1932, here Nagel holds white and Margulis holds black. Nagel starts with a pawn to d4, Margulis a pawn to d5, a pawn to c4. Queen Gambit. Margulis rejects Gambit and advances the pawn to c6. Continue knight to f3, knight to f6. Knight continued to c3, then Margulis was interested in taking c4's pawn with a pawn. Nagel advances with a pawn to a4. Bishop to f5, knight to e5 attacks the pawn c4. Margulis, the pawn to c5, hits the pawn, and Nagel the pawn to e4 attacks bishop. Margulis, knight takes e4. Continue Nagel queen to f3. Attack bishop. Since bishop is protecting knight at e4, pawn advances to g6 protecting bishop. It might be better for Margulis, but Margulis replies with pawn takes pawn d4. The idea also attacks knight c3, but Nagel, queen takes bishop f5, continues checkmate threat with queen takes f7. Margulis was forced to save knight to d6, guard f7's pawn and attack queen. Nagel doesn't save the queen, but bishop takes pawn c4. The idea is that if knight takes queen, then bishop takes pawn f7 will still be checkmate, and vice versa. If knight takes bishop, queen takes pawn f7, obviously checkmate will occur. So here Margulis advances pawn to e6, attacks queen, Nagel bishop to g5, check. Remember, if knight takes bishop, queen will take pawn f7, there will be a checkmate, and knight block check, it will be better for Margulis, but here Margulis avoids checkmate by going to e7. And finally the real checkmate in 3 moves will start here. You can pause the video to find it. And yes, y'all are really awesome, just as you think, i.e. knight to g6. Check, knight sacrifice. Actually, if pawn f takes knight, bishop to g5 will immediately occur checkmate, so here Margulis chooses pawn h takes knight. Knight e5, check. Still knight sacrifice, another forced step, pawn takes knight. And the last queen e5, checkmate. Alright everyone, so that's the ferocity of the Queen Gambit opening. If you like it, please support this channel by pressing the subscribe button and like the video. Look forward to other interesting videos from the I Love This Game channel. See you soon.